For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio rise?
Consent to address the House for 5 minutes and to include extraneous material in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the economic pain in the Midwestern region of our country is not subsiding in any meaningful way. Approximately 600,000, over 500,000 Americans are out of work in just our state alone, and over 20 million Americans across our country. In our district, one county, Ottawa County, is suffering from an unemployment rate that exceeds 17%, and just yesterday, another one of its largest employers, Silgan, announced it would close its plant. There have been approximately 27,000 bankruptcies in just one county in my district. Bankruptcy is a desperate act, an act taken only when you see no other alternative. Today's New York Times talks about desperate measures that homeowners across our country are now taking. The front page article describes the growing number of Americans who are underwater on their mortgages and the steps they're taking to cope with that situation. Being underwater means you owe more on the house than it's worth. More and more homeowners who are underwater are taking the desperate act of walking away from their homes, even in the winter. When the real estate market started sinking in the middle of 2006, almost no Americans were underwater on their mortgages. Now, 3 years later, an estimated 4.5 million homeowners have reached what the Times calls the critical threshold, where the home's value had fallen below 75% of the mortgage balance. Frankly, as I predicted, the mortgage workout programs hastily adopted by this Congress are not working. For the majority of Americans, some would say this is purposeful, to allow the 5 big Wall Street megabanks to further gain ownership over huge segments of the U.S. real estate market. The New York Times cites recent data that suggests the real estate market is stalling again, and the number of people who have fallen below this critical threshold is projected to climb to a peak of 5.1 million people by June. Mr. Speaker, the figure would represent 10% of all Americans with mortgages, 1 in 10. This is unacceptable in America. And without improvement in the housing market, America is unlikely to see improvement in the overall economy because housing always leads us into recovery. All of us are anxious to see more economic growth. The most recent gross domestic product showed that the American economy overall had grown at the fastest pace in 6 years, certainly better than the lost jobs of the Bush era. But now, economists are saying we're headed for a jobless recovery. That is unacceptable. Peter Marcy states we will need 5 to 6% growth over the next 3 years to replace the jobs that have been lost during the recession. And Raymond Hodgson, in his economic report out of Chicago, suggests the same number. Our nation got to these desperate times through the financial crisis. Our economy essentially functions on credit, and much of our credit was created through the securitization of loans, which should lead to a discussion of the shadow banking system, a secretive, opaque netherworld where fraud can thrive even as it devastates the entire country. Equally in the shadows is the Federal Reserve. Last week we had a hearing in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee with Secretary Geithner of Treasury in his role as president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank during the AIG bailout. The Secretary stated he had recused himself from such activities as the bailout of AIG once he was nominated as Secretary of the Treasury. But when I asked him for his recusal agreement for the record, he stated there was no documentation. No recusal agreement exists. Nothing legal, no waiver, nothing. He made decisions, and only he is accountable for them. There was a gasp in the room. Beyond the shadowland of our nation's financial system, our small community banks are struggling as bad loans from commercial and residential real estate continue to plague our financial system. The small community banks that have survived are trying to lend to small businesses, which are the main engine of our economy. But they cannot do so if the big banks are holding credit hostage. And turning to TARP is not the answer for our community banks, because it isn't Treasury's job to pick winners and losers in the commercial marketplace. That should be a market function. The end result is that small businesses are dying too. The small community banks cannot loan to local small business. Without access to credit, small business is letting people go too, and they're becoming unemployed. And meanwhile, the Wall Street banks are just getting bigger, using federal money to gain an edge on their competition. Mr. Speaker, this situation is simply unacceptable, and it's time for Congress to rework legislation to allow people to stay in their homes and to begin creating jobs in this country so we can actually bring the deficit down as people pay their taxes to the Treasury of the United States. I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from Kansas.